I mean, for the person who sneezed, and also bless you for showing. And who just came in? That is Robert.
No.
Sorry, you're not Robert. You're Lucian.
Yep.
Huh? Actually, that was faux confidence when I just said the second one. Anyway, I was assuming I knew a couple people are sick. It's about that time of year. I'm actually starting to feel it now. It's probably not appropriate to blame my children whenever I get a cold or whatever, but it's their damn fault because they don't wash their hands. They'll touch anything at all, and then they'll proceed to eat. I mean, they're 6 and 8, and they still test things with their damn mouths. So I'm probably sick, but I'm fine. I'm not, you'll be fine. Lot to do today. Maybe there's a lot missing, either because they're sick or Frege has disgusted them, so much so that they've decided it's not worth it. We'll discuss that. Let me pass out your quizzes from last time real quick so you get a look at them. I made comments on them. Let me know if you can't read them. Paula and Jacob, Ella, Ben, and Lucian. Robert, Lake, and that's it. Sounds like I had another person there. James and Jordan. Jacob and Riley. Isaac and Bianca. Blake and Madeline. Here. Just hold on to it if the other person's not here. Brandon and Brock. Chase and Tyler. Take a moment to look these through. Antonia and Everardo. Abdullah and Alicia. Casey and Dee. And Alexi and Miley and Logan. Who just came in? Jacob?
Yes.
Wait, yes.
Well, I got mine.
I know, but I didn't get you on the list. Did I? No. All right. Today, I've tasked myself, well, it's just happened this way, with an extraordinary amount of material to cover. I'm going to do my best. If we don't cover it all, no big deal. I don't want to speed through it. I want to wrap up where we left off with William James. Then we're going to jump to your discussions. Let me get something here. Of your readings for today, and then we'll try to get through them as best we can. And Robert just came in, yes? All right. So don't despair if you didn't do great on that quiz. There are other quizzes, and everyone did well, ultimately speaking. So not a lot of points on that quiz. They're only 10 points each. Please let me know if you can't read my handwriting. You can have those quizzes. You can share them with each other since there's groups of 2. Part of the question was, how is the pragmatism of James distinct from the pragmaticism of Peirce? And I was worried that someone would put, well, they're spelled differently. And then that would be the end of it. I'm glad that was not the case. One of the key differences, well, first of all, both of them are interested in the notion that the truth of an idea is not something that's static. And that's going to be extremely important as we go forward. But also, the truth of an idea has to do with that which, for Peirce, is external to the individual. James agrees up to a point. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Up to a point, there's agreement there. For Peirce, think of it in terms of science. How does science accumulate facts and determine what is right, what is true or false, based upon objective reality, measurable reality, that which is external to us and wholly external to us? Truth can't be a matter of the whims of an individual. New shirt every day. That's really catches. That is dependent on the individual, or with respect to tenacity among community, relative to a particular group or culture. That way lies all sorts of trouble. That way lies there be dragons, as Frankfurt puts it in so many words, with his critiques of what can generally be called continental philosophy, but he's specifically focusing on something called postmodernism, which I will only very briefly discuss. James seems to say to Peircean forms of pragmatism. I like what you're doing. It makes sense. It's empiricism. I like empiricism. I'm a radical, James says, a radical empiricist. We can use experience as the mode for establishing truth of our ideas and for determining what makes the most sense to us. I'm radical, James says, because I include in my empiricism an evaluation, the recognition of metaphysical claims, and in particular, and some of you pointed this out, theological claims, to the extent that believing in them, one way or the other, believing, having a particular worldview with respect to, what did we talk about last time, transubstantiation. If that affects me in a particular way such that it causes differences in my behavior, it makes a practical difference to me if I believe that the wafer is the body of Christ, the wine is the blood of Christ. Those are theological issues. How can they possibly be something that's observable in the scientific conception, the way that Peirce describes it? Peirce sees that as purely metaphysical, meaningless nonsense, ultimately, is what he calls it. And his views are going to be very influential later on with logical positivists. We'll see A.J. Ayer in next week, in fact. Is it next week? Yes, with logical positivism. An interesting link between the two. James finds the worry of neglecting, cutting off as avenues of potential knowledge, of potential usefulness, metaphysical and, in particular, theological musings and experiences in particular. In fact, his whole varieties of religious experiences addressing for the individual, the illuminative characteristics of these kinds of religious experiences. I'm not going to go into that now. If you're interested in James's view on religion, allow me to advertise a class next semester, Philosophy of Religion. You should take that class. That's where we'll focus. We will actually discuss James in particular with his discussion of religion. That's yours?
Yeah.
Oh, I referenced that in the last class. What is vain? Frightened. It's a frightening image. Is it a band?
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm guessing it's heavy metal.
That is something.
It has to be. You can't call yourself vain and have that picture and be pop music. To their credit, I got to tell. I could tell by the image. Anyway, what does James mean? James wants to find that middle ground between the tender and the tough-minded. He seems to be his radical empiricism sounds like, oh, that's the scientific method. Experience. He's trained in science, but of course, specifically psychology. We talked about that last time. Peirce also has a background in science, physics in particular. There's a distinction between those two. He likes the idea of tough-mindedness, but he doesn't like it if it goes too far. Not just applying the scientific method, but what does he call it negatively? Scientism, which is different than saying we can apply the scientific method to these particular problems. Is our hypothesis fruitful? Does it have a broad scope? Is it applying Occam's razor, theoretical parsimony, and all these other principles we use in science? His concern is that when we tie a purely materialistic, physicalistic presumption through the scientific method to all relevant questions that humans have, and that's a broad topic, that turns into scientism, as if we can answer all of our relevant questions through that. And so he wants to keep the a priori metaphysical elements such that they don't abstract too far away from lived experience. And in fact, it's a very interesting view, a very interesting take on scientism, which he thinks is too abstracting, because it's seeking universal truths about human nature through the scientific method, which seems to be limiting and reductivist, overly so. And we'll come back to this theme throughout. Reducing human nature to our most minute components, which is a kind of analysis, as we'll see. And on the other hand, you have abstract, metaphysical a priori theorizing that doesn't concern itself, it seems, as Peirce says, with the physical concrete existence at all. It's purely a priori, metaphysical, abstract thinking. And in both cases, it's a concern of too much abstraction. And we'll see the Kierkegaardian view, the existentialist view, critiquing science as being too abstracting away. I gave an example of something like objects falling at the same rate. All objects, all science tells us, all objects fall at the same rate, 9.8 meters per second squared. But we decided that's only in a certain situation. And what is that situation? In a vacuum, which is as extreme form of abstraction from reality as it gets, it seems. On the other hand, you've got the Hegelian, the Kantian abstraction through metaphysics that seems to be too far removed from particular individual lives. In both cases, James finds them to be problematic, and so he tries to find a middle ground, a practical ground, pragmatic middle ground between those two extremes. And this is what I wanted to, there's a lot with James to focus on. I'm going to have to narrow in the interest of time. When you first read this, this might have sounded just totally right on. Page 12 of the reading. It is useful, a belief, whatever it might be, because it is true. Or it is true because it is useful. Both these phrases mean exactly the same thing, namely that here is an idea that gets fulfilled and can be verified. Do you agree that those mean the same thing? Or do you have a counter example to James which says, no, wait a minute. This seems maybe too individualistic, too subjective, perhaps? Go ahead.
Isn't that like I don't want to say fallacy, but like, can't you come up with like a counterexample of like any time when it's set up that way? Like, it is here because it is there. So it is there because it is here. Kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, it looks like it is a reflexive claim that works either direction. It is useful because it is true, and it is true because it is useful. Does it go both directions, and does it keep the same meaning? James seems to imply that it does. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. Let's fill in with different content to see if the structure of that claim makes sense. You had your hand up first.
I think it's different because it's essentially saying, like, if you've got two circles, you could have all useful things being within a larger circle of true things, or all true things being within the larger circle of useful things. So it would say all true things necessarily have to be useful, as opposed to all useful things have to be true. So
Yeah, right.
yeah, so they're not exactly the same.
Is it the case that they're all equal? And if not, do we rather say anything that is true must be part of the category of usefulness, such that usefulness is the operative concept, the important concept that grounds our truthfulness? That's what James seems to have been saying the whole time. And then he throws this in here and says, oh no, I mean both. And it's a complete overlap. Whatever is useful is also true, and whatever is true is also useful. That's an interesting claim. He gives an easy example when you're lost in the woods and you're trying to find, and you think you see tracks or something to a cabin, right? Is that the example he gives? Did you remember that example? And you have beliefs regarding whether or not that is a cabin, and in those situations, life or death situation, truth matters. We'll see that that's going to be a pretty big deal with respect to Harry Frankfurt as well. But the other way around, whatever is useful, is that true? Does anyone have an example? I'm sorry, there's a hand I missed too. Does anyone have an example? I'll just throw this question out and then I'll get your question. Of something that's useful, but you'd say, wait a minute, I'm not sure that is true in any meaningful sense. First your question, and then I'll get you. I'm sorry?
God and religion.
God and religion. Oh, so you're answering the question. God, belief in God is useful, and you're saying, but you know it's false? The claim God exists, that's useful, but false.
Could be possibly.
Possibly false. Okay? All right, I see. Go.
The fact, the simple fact that you know you're going to wake up tomorrow, it's useful because it helps give you a general idea of what's going to happen, but it's not always true because you don't 100% know you're going to wake up tomorrow. I know it's sad to say, but it's true.
Well, here, but we want to. Those are interesting examples that seem to have doubt in them. I'm looking for an example of, a counterexample to James, where something that we might say is useful, yet we know it's not true. Do you see what I mean? I'm pretty sure I'm going to wake up tomorrow. I'm not so stoical that I say to myself, about my children, Stoics, some Stoics would go this far, before you go to bed at night, think to yourself, your children may not wake up alive. And then when you wake up tomorrow and they are alive, awesome. But this could always be taken away from us. And so, yeah, there's doubt there. I'm looking, though, for something that is useful, but we would all say, it's probably not true. Go ahead.
Lies in regard to one's personal conduct can be useful under many circumstances.
Lies about our own conduct. If I lie to myself, wait a minute, lies to yourself?
No, lies to other people in regard to one's own actions. Like if you want to avoid incarceration or punishment for any reason,
very
social condemnation.
Yes, and if you believe it, as George Costanza says to Jerry, trying to pass the lie detector test, remember, Jerry, if you believe it, it's not a lie. That's true. It is. But if you've convinced yourself, can you convince yourself that something is true where you know at first it's not? I thought you were going to get into self-deception. That's something we're going to get to with existentialism. They call that, in particular, bad faith, which is a kind of lie to the self, which raises all sorts of interesting complexities, but may be an example as a counterexample, too, in this case. So that's a very good one, yes?
Propaganda.
Propaganda is useful, and oftentimes propaganda is the spreading of lies. Yeah, it works. Propaganda works, yeah. Another example. I don't know what James would say. I'm going to think about this, because in order for James seems to say a lot. I'll get your hands and say he seems to want to, forgive this ridiculous phrase, but have his cake and also eat it. He says, in order to find that middle ground, he needs to kind of give and take, maybe too much. Because at one point he'll say, in order for something to be true, and for you to accept it as a useful belief that affects you in a positive way, that moves your life forward, that belief has to pass through the gauntlet of all your other beliefs. Well, telling a lie doesn't do that. So on one interpretation of James, propaganda isn't true, and it ultimately isn't useful, because it's failing to get through those other claims, even if in that particular moment it may benefit you. So it's not obvious what James's view is going to be here. Who was the next? Yeah, and then here.
What about things like self-esteem, like after trauma, or if you have PTSD, like your beliefs because of those events are that like maybe you're worthless or whatever, but like it's not necessarily useful. So like I don't know. There's a lot of therapies that like try to make you believe the opposite, that you are useful.
Yeah. Well, useful.
Or work.
Sure, right. And that kind of appeal to. Yeah, that's a tough one. We're going to get more into that particular issue with Camus and questions of meaning of life in a different sense than we are going with Frege today. Although I guess I should have flip-flopped it. September is Suicide Prevention Month, right? Suicide Awareness Month, I think it is.
It was Suicide Prevention Day, I think.
Day. Oh, that's a whole month perhaps devoted to it.
Maybe it should be a whole month.
Right. And we'll talk about that with respect to what are the mechanisms as an individual that we can adopt to help us in a Jamesian pragmatic sense to give us meaning, to give us purpose, to move us forward, to make us feel at home, to use James's language, to feel at home in the world, and also collectively. It's a very difficult topic, and we're actually going to be spending a bit of time on that in his Myth of Sisyphus. He starts with the opening lines of the Myth of Sisyphus. There's only one important question in philosophy, and that is whether life is worth living. Until we answer that, everything else is mere games. Imagine reading Camus, that, and then reading Frege on sense and reference. You might think, what the hell, Frege, you need to go read Camus. And by the way, Camus' answer is, yes, it is worth it. Life is worth it. You should not commit suicide, but hold off on that for now. Go ahead.
What about like a fictional novel? Like good fictional novel because it's not necessarily true. It isn't true. It's not real events.
It's fiction, yeah.
But you get from it like themes and motifs and
Yeah.
a good story.
I think James would distinguish that from claims about beliefs, because I don't have beliefs about the stories. It's more complicated than that. I remember years ago we had a philosophy club meeting with a member of the English department talking about poetry, and that poetry is just a bunch of lies. But that doesn't mean it's not offering something like parables and thought experiments in philosophy. The allegory of the cave, for those of you in the intro class will remember, that's not something that's actually happened. It's not truthful. But, of course, that misses the point of aphorisms. That misses the point of allegories. Aesop's fables, nobody reads that and says, nonsense. Animals can't talk, and therefore disregard everything in it. And so, think of the novels like To Kill a Mockingbird. If you want to address issues of racism, and you can convince somebody who may need to read that to read the whole thing, that may be way more effective, even though it's fiction, than giving them an argument in standard logical form. Here's why you shouldn't be a racist, right? And I don't know I think James would be fine with that, because the truths, the beliefs that come out of the fiction, there's a whole lot to say about this, are actually something that they do work. And the truths come from the fictions. They come from whether it's poetry, whether it's storytelling, whether it's allegory, thought experiment, and so forth. Yeah?
What about placebo effect?
Oh, damn. There's too much to talk about here. Yes, I was just listening to a podcast on Econ Talk, of all things. Anyone familiar with Econ Talk? Russ Peters, anyone know? Doesn't matter. I can't
Russell
be.
Peters?
No, not Russell Peters, a different person. Russ Roberts. And they were talking about the placebo effect. And doctors know that it works. We don't know exactly why it works, which is fascinating. But we know that it works. In fact, we know it works when we tell the patient, this is a placebo. And it helps them, right? And we know that there's one case of surgery in which, you can tell the patient, all right, here's the surgery for your back. We're going to open you up, and in this particular case, applying what is ultimately cement to a particular area of your back is going to fix your back problem. And in one study, they actually, instead of actually doing the procedure, literally doing it, they just opened up a bag of cement. That psychologically affected them to the extent that the pain went away. Same thing with you need knee surgery. Or rather, you have knee problems, knee pain. And so the physician will, in some cases, actually have an incision in the knee and then not do anything else other than that. And it works. Are they lying? It's not true, but it works. It's useful. And there, I think placebo effects on a pragmatic account are very interesting, to say the least. Yeah?
Can the scientific validity of a placebo effect kind of support people saying we should pray?
It depends. So James would talk about this. There was a controversial issue at the time where James was dealing with patients who would not take their kids to the doctor. They're Christian Scientists. This is back in the 1880s, 1890s. And he was concerned about that. It wasn't clear where he should have where to rest on that. And it's not obvious today, right? Look, your belief system we don't want to interfere with until or unless it's going to negatively harm other people. If your practice of helping yourself is simply to pray and not go to the doctor for medicine or something like that, well, the government can't do much about that. If your prayer is used to help your child, and you can take your child to the doctor to cure them of an ailment, but you do not take them to the doctor, you can be punished under the law. Whether or not that's acceptable morally, logically, that's a different issue. On the face of it, it sounds, yeah, of course, that's neglect. You've neglected your child. You don't get to decide. You're not the expert in this. We have people who can cure an ailment, and we do not have evidence. I'll just state this outright. we do not have evidence for or against the notion that prayer is efficacious for others. We don't have evidence. We do have evidence that prayer can be efficacious to an individual with respect to changing their mental states, as we do with respect to meditation. We do not have evidence that prayer can change the course of hurricanes, for example. Did we talk about that last class? Remember Hurricane Dorian struck, and I believe it was Marianne Williamson, running for president of the United States of America, did make the claim that if we prayed collectively, we can get the hurricane to go a different direction. You'd have to look into the details of exactly how she said it. I may be engaged in a straw man here and misrepresenting her words, so I apologize if that's the case, but I'm pretty sure that's what she said. And there's no evidence that that is the case. Yeah, that we can do that with her mind.
So with what he was saying, I forget like the exact wording, but so it has to be purely subjective to like one's own belief and not like a group of beliefs or a group of people's beliefs, right?
James?
Yeah.
Peirce says that eventually we will converge on the truth collectively through scientific endeavors. So that's not the individual. James seems to imply, no, there are certain situations in which it's acceptable for me to believe something because it will work for me. That seems to be this. There's no such thing as a disinterested truth. As if we could be outside of any particular situation and say, here's the truth. We are always already embedded. And here this is going to be, this language, I think this came up last class maybe, is straight out of, or could well have been Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a very different view with respect to what truth is, as we're going to see when we look at his work on truth and lies in a non-moral sense.
I mean, maybe I read it wrong, but he's saying it has to be verified, or it is verified. So in that, I don't know, you can't, if you're verifying your own beliefs, but because if you were to take that sentence from an objective standpoint, even philosophy isn't true, but it's useful, because not all philosophies are
well, we have to be careful with that word. Philosophy is broad. It has, if I may, to borrow Frege, different senses. Because a philosophy could be an opinion, or it could be the discipline itself, which is very broad. So we wouldn't say that that philosophy is not true. That'd be like saying biology is not true.
Yeah,
so we want to say someone's particular...
that's kind of idealisms in general, people's idealisms are... can you go back to the slide? I had,
which one? I'm sorry.
One where you had what you were saying at the end.
This one?
One.
Oh, the one we were started with.
Sorry, so it's here's an idea that gets fulfilled and can be verified.
Uh-huh.
So my point is if it's subjective, how can you verify it? If it's your own belief.
Right. That's why James tries to have it both ways. Because at once he says, look, if I'm that dude stuck in between the rocks, he made a whole movie about it, 120 hours, whatever. 127. You know what? After 1 hour, things are going to be terrible. I don't care how much. If I get that wrong, that's where the dude got stuck in the canyon. And I've not seen it, and I'm not going to. I know. I understand what's going on. I don't need to see the horror of somebody with it's a Swiss Army knife, is it not?
The whole Swiss Army knife has to stab his
It's
own.
not even that much of the movie. That's a small section.
And it does.
The rest of it is just him there saying, "Wow."
It's not like Saw where it shows the knife going in and out in the.
Oh.
It's not like that.
Okay, good. Anyway, just sorry.
He has to cook his feet.
Let me. For those who haven't seen it and don't have any interest in seeing it, it's not as bloody as apparently I thought it would be. Guy gets stuck in a cave. Or a crevasse or crevice.
That's what it is. It's weird the way they picked them.
And he has no justification for the belief that he can escape alive by cutting off his damn arm. He has no background information that tells him, well, inductively, last time I tried this, it worked. This is the one time only this has happened. And I'll bet in the movie he's not saying to himself, oh boy, this isn't going to work. Might as well try it. I'll bet it's you can do this, believe, fake it till you, well, I probably didn't say fake it till you make it, but that's, at some points, James seems to be implying that. In others, he's saying, you know what, when there is a momentous option, when it's a living option, you have a choice, literally living option here, and it's forced, you have the right to choose to believe.
Really forced his hand.
That's inappropriate. Oh, that's quite good. Forced his hand, he said. Oh, I wanted to get to that last part. So, this requires us to become consciously responsible. So we need a method for marshaling the will. And here I think I'll end with James. My first act of freedom will be to believe in free will. I'm just trying to bring in Rush, Geddy Lee of free will, if you're familiar with them. I will choose free will, which is a great phrase. And the lyricist for Rush was Neil Peart, the drummer, who was a philosophy major. Or I think it was a philosophy major. Why is it that you get to choose to believe here? This is very different language than we saw with Peirce. This seems to be subjective. Who's talking about subjective? Yeah, this seems to be, well, you know what? What are the cash payouts for me? If I believed in free will, how would that change the way that I live? If I believed in determinism, that there is no free will, how would that change the way that I lived? That seems to be particular. That's a living option. I can choose to believe in one or the other. It's a forced option. I'm either a determinist or a free willist. We might disagree with that because there is another middle ground called compatibilism. James will call that, what does he call that? Kind of like agnosticism. Like, I don't know, it's kind of a both. And he calls that a weak position. Basically, like agnosticism without balls is what he might call that. But more cleverly, he would say it. But think about how it affects me with respect to that belief. Holding that belief. What are the practical, material differences to me upon holding that belief? If there are legitimately good intellectual arguments on either side. He's not saying, I'm going to choose to believe that I can fly. No, there are good arguments against that possibility. In fact, way more. And you'll learn very quickly that you can't fly. You can't choose to believe in that sense. He was mocked for his notion, his language on the right to believe, the will to believe, as it were. But if the arguments for free will are equally combated by the arguments against it, then what matters is the practical consequences to me. And that should determine my belief in that case. So there you'll find a fundamental difference between Peirce and James. And it leads to, there's a lot more we could say about that, and I will, in the philosophy of religion class. But I like how he ends, or rather how he starts, because it's early in the text. But this is a great way of ending with James. He says, philosophy is at once the most sublime and most trivial of human pursuits. I hope you get that in the Frege reading today. I hope you'll see that it's sublime and also, it's trivial, yes, but also sublime. I should have done it the other direction. This seems terribly trivial, terribly nitpicking, terribly unnecessarily narrowly focused on a particular matter of language, but we'll see how important it is. It works in the minutest crannies, that's analytic philosophy, and opens up the widest vistas. It bakes no bread. I would rephrase that. It doesn't always provide us with practical utility in a kind of economic sense, certainly, as has been said, but it can inspire our souls with courage, and repugnant as its manners, its doubting and challenging can be sometimes, its quibbling and dialectics often are to common people. No one of us can get along without the far-flashing beams of light it sends over the world's perspectives. I think that's a fantastic quotation that also encapsulates his effort at mending the gaps between the tough and the tender-minded. And I think it's a great transition to the Frankfurt reading, which I'm going to start with. I know in the syllabus we had the order backwards, with Frege first and then Frankfurt. Also, I don't do your reflections till after class because I want to see who's here so I don't grade it twice. But I did look them over, and if I just went by which reading you chose to reflect upon, then I wouldn't even talk about Frege at all, because almost no one wrote anything on Frege. Totally fine. Totally get it. Totally. However, I will be talking about Frege, but I'm going to narrow in on a particular issue. So what I want to do now is break you into your small groups, 2 or 3. If you want to move into a different group, that's awesome. That's a good idea. You don't have to. I don't want to cause discomfort, but please get into your groups to discuss your reflections on whatever reading you did, either one. All right, and then we'll get into it. Yes. Yes, go on. Critique something, but is also finds it as a legitimate source of information. He's way more difficult to get than person. He uses applications. He's all over the place. We'll get to him later, but he is not fond of Christianity. That is certain. But you can be like Francis Collins, who's head of the Genome Project, or he was head scientist, also Christian, Catholic, and they're not necessarily diametrically opposed. But that's a question more for the classical religion class. But it will come up when we look at actually week 14. We'll talk about Nietzsche and religion. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you all. How you doing? Good to bring you back. So, let me get right into it. I have a lot to do. I'm not going to go through all the stuff that I have on the slides. That's totally fine. That's just as a kind of scaffolding or whatever for what I want to talk about. But what are we doing when we engage in analysis? What are we doing when we engage particularly in analytic philosophy? Let me just go through some of the stages that I think you have already started going through. What to expect. First, you'll say to yourself, my God, this is tedious. Why in the world does it matter to me what the syntactic distinctions are between certain words? Why care about the truth, value, or meaninglessness of the sentence, the present King of France is bald? Who cares? That's Bertrand Russell, which we will get into that concept a little bit, but not much. You don't have a reading on that particular one. That's on denoting. The next stage, oh my God, not only is this shit tedious, it's hard as hell to understand. What in the world does Russell, for example, mean with his Barber paradox, which we'll also talk a little bit about, which happens to be also called the Russell paradox of the set of all set that is not a member of itself. That's your favorite paradox?
No, it's math. So
What?
it's math.
It's in math. That's right. That's right. What happens if you go to a barber who only shaves people who do not shave themselves? What would you do? Anyway, what in the world is Wittgenstein doing with his koan-like aphorisms? A koan is in Taoist philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, Zen Buddhist philosophy. It is a kind of saying riddle that doesn't seem to have any logical answer to it. We'll come back to that. Then slowly you'll find that language does matter. It's all about language. Everything. Meaning is about the use of symbols that are somehow about the world and our place in it. We can't understand anything until we comprehend the relationship between our words and the world. And that includes meaning in the existentialist sense. And then you'll say, damn. And then you'll become a full-fledged member of the Analytic Party. You'll have a pledge, probably. Or you'll start your own Facebook group wherein you will attack the nonsensical continental philosophers with memes such as this, where you mock them.
Could you go back?
Oh, you don't need to write these down. Are you really writing those down? You'll have access to these slides, though. Don't worry about that. But you don't need to get all of these words down. This is not exactly what you're going to say to yourself, but you've probably said some of these things to yourself already. And then you're going to have second thoughts and realize, wait a minute, but I like continental breakfasts. See how much better they are than the analytic breakfast? And to an extent, this is a legitimate representation of the breakfasts that would get served. These are hexagons that are flavorless. Somebody did a great job. You can see that it's actually cut squash. It's cut squash. They just manipulated it. It's quite good. But that looks way better. That looks more fulfilling do you see?
And taste.
This seems less fulfilling. It may be filling, but what good are we getting out of it? I'm exaggerating these points a little bit here for
It
purposes
says
of effect.
hexagons, but I see one octagon.
Oh,
I see
for God's
one
sake.
septagon.
Yeah. This was
False
manipulated
I want my money
from
back.
slosh. For the sake of memes, you're getting too deep into the minutia. But well done with your insightful analysis that we'll see with Frege.
I see it's a hexagon.
Speaking of which, let's look at some of the virtues. Well, they all came out at once, sorry. One of the first is obvious, and the first few go together. Clarity. Avoid ambiguity. Avoid vagueness. Clarity, precision. Ambiguity is where you've got a concept, a term that has more than one distinct meaning. Vagueness is where you have a term, a concept, an idea that is fuzzy, on a spectrum or something like that. If indeed you have a concept that is fuzzy, indistinct, then you need to make it more precise. And English in particular is subject to lots of vagaries. We use language all the time, and oftentimes without much thought. It's important for us to clarify. In particular, there is rigor or formal and informal logic. In particular, contemporary philosophy owes a debt to Gottlob Frege as basically the originator of what we would call contemporary logic, quantificational logic, which was in many ways an advancement of Aristotelian logic, which hadn't changed much since Frege. In fact, even Kant at one point had said, you don't really need to do much with logic. Aristotle pretty much got it, nailed it, we're done. We don't need to evaluate it anymore or amend it. That was false. Hegel came along and did some other things with it, but very different than what Frege began with his quantificational, truth, functional semantics. Just a bit of a mouthful. Sentences have meaning, and the meaning is dependent upon the parts of the sentence and how they're composed. Truth functional. It's where we get the influence on Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein gives us, if you take in the logic class, the formal logic class, truth tables, which you may, or in math too, you do truth tables, which you may be very upset about for having ever had to learn them, because they can be quite tedious. But insofar as establishing truth value of our claims, it's a pretty useful tool. Not to mention it's helpful in making computers work. Creativity as well, though. So we showed you those flavorless hexagons. There's some creativity. There is conceptual creativity. If there's a gap in our understanding, sometimes we've got to come up with, coin new terms that can pull out and make us think differently in conceptual terms in a way that we could not if we didn't have the conceptual tools beforehand. Certain thoughts are impossible without certain kinds of conceptual tools. And sometimes they need to be invented. They need to be developed. And analytic philosophers are not merely, what do you call that? We're in the assembly line, just picking out little bits of details. Russell's negative view of science, of just accumulating detailed facts and then putting them in order. That's not all that analytic philosophy does. That's not all you're doing when you are engaged in analysis, conceptual analysis. Fruitfulness. These are actually also things you'll find as scientific virtues as well. It's not coincidental. As along with Peirce, Frege looks at philosophy very much in line with science, as almost itself a science. As I said, Ludwig Wittgenstein will be very much influenced by Frege. We'll disagree about that. He'll put philosophy and science next to one another, not saying which one has predominance. There's a huge debate over that. We won't get into that. And systematicity. That's a great word. Think about mathematics. Analytic philosophers, they systematically chip away at particular problems. Where we have a huge issue, a huge dilemma, whatever, maybe it's consciousness, which is a big issue in philosophy of mind today. It's one of the biggest issues in philosophy today. And I would argue it should be one of the biggest issues in neuroscience. I don't know that it is, but it ought to be. How can you tackle that? You can't just jump in and say, in some general sense, there's so much information now. So many people are now looking at it from the sides, looking at tiny little bits and pieces that they can untie to get a little sense of. And then if we get that, that will help us understand these other elements. But these are the things we have to break it down into its component parts and systematically analyze it to make sense of it. Any other approach is going to be way too broad. It's not going to be able to delve down deeply enough. Systematic thinking is not necessarily the ideal approach, as we'll see with people like Nietzsche, and in particular Kierkegaard, who hated the systematic theorizing that is too abstracting in people like Hegel and Kant, for instance. Hegel is one that Kierkegaard responds to. And there you find similarities with James as well. Now, having all of that, that's in the background of Harry Frankfurt. There's Harry Frankfurt. There's his little book on truth, and also on bullshit. On bullshit was a paper he wrote in 1986. And his publisher said, you know what? In 2006, I think it was, or 2005. 2005. His publisher said, you know what? You ought to turn that paper that you wrote to professional philosophers into a book to sell to the populace. And Frankfurt thought and said, well, that's kind of a species of bullshit itself, isn't it? To make a book out of a paper, not changing anything. It's a book that's 60 pages, if the pages are this small. It's a very small book, and it's a bestseller. It was one of the few texts that, in the history of philosophy, that was geared toward a specific professional audience that became a popular text. And Harry Frankfurt burst into the scene in 2006 when he went on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart loves this idea of bullshit and political spin, which are different things. Go ahead.
Is On Truth a sequel or a prequel?
More like a prequel because, as Frankfurt puts it, a lot of people, he said something like, I thought I'd addressed questions of bullshit and I was done with it, but it turns out I had more. There's more I should have said. Hold on. At the time, this first page, or as I put it, page 0. I don't know why I did that. Sorry. Is that how it came up on yours? Of the Frankfurt reading on truth. Do you have it with you? You don't have it with you?
It's page 0.
It is page 0?
Yeah.
You don't have to print these out, but it's not a bad idea. In that book, at that time it seemed like enough. I realized later, however, that I had paid no attention at all in my book to an issue, you should call it a paper, to an issue which any adequate discussion of bullshit must certainly deal. I had made an important assumption which I had offhandedly supposed most of my readers would share, that is, being indifferent to the truth is an undesirable or even a reprehensible characteristic, and bullshitting is therefore to be avoided and condemned. So he talked about bullshit, and bullshit, in summary, is a lack of concern for truth. It is to spit out cliches in an unthinking fashion. Bullshit. Different than lies, because we talked a little bit about deception earlier. If I'm deceiving you, I have to at least think I know what the truth is, and then hide it. That's actually a lot of work. That takes some cognitive energy. And it shows an interest in reality, in the way that the world is. It's just that I'm trying to hide what I think that is. And I could be wrong. I can actually happen upon the truth, right? I could be lying to you and saying, I can say A is the case. And yet, in my mind, I'm lying. It's really B. But A may actually truly be the case. So I told you the truth, but I'm still lying. Do you see why? Because a lie has to do with the mental state of the individual, insofar as they think they know what the truth is and are hiding it from you. They at least care enough about reality and the words that they speak, whereas the bullshitter is indifferent to reality, indifferent to the truth. And that's how Frankfurt on Truth, sums up postmodernism, for better or worse. I think he's got it to a point. Perhaps we'll see today, maybe, wait a minute, that's not quite what... and we'll talk about what postmodernism in the most general sense. It's a very difficult concept to define. It's, in fact, not definable, really. Yeah.
I think you pretty much answered my question. I was just pretty much asking, so he thinks bullshitters don't really think about what they're saying and just come constantly give out verbal diarrhea, even if it's true or not?
I guess that does go along with bullshit, doesn't it? Yes. They'll say what works in the moment. Is it inconsistent with what they said before? Who cares? Doesn't matter. Is this true? I don't know.
Sounds
Doesn't
like my
matter.
family shoot.
A what?
Sounds like my family.
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't know. I know I said yes. Yeah, it does. I have no idea. I meant, like, I don't know what I meant. There, that's a bit of bullshit there. That's just a little verbal crutch. Yeah, right. You're not even saying anything. So I'm sorry for that.
It's okay.
What is truth? He's not going to be interested in this brief paper of trying to establish in a kind of propositional sense of grounding our claims so that we can know this is true versus this is false. He's simply saying, here's why the concept of truth is important, and it ought not be disregarded. This is the famous Pontius Pilate confronting Jesus. Jesus says he's coming with the truth. He is the truth. And Pontius says, what is truth? And then if you remember the story, I think Pontius Pilate just walks away or something. Is that what happened? I think that was it. That was so interesting. What is truth? And then leaves. Jesus may have had an answer. The Bible could have been totally different if Pontius Pilate just stuck around. And then Frege comes out. Well, truth is, you see, truth, conditional semantic. What does it mean for this particular proposition to be true? I forgot that. Look like that. Here's Frankfurt coming out telling us the importance of truth. He says, this is like page 3. It is well known, of course, that a cavalier attitude toward truth, the bullshitter, is more or less endemic within the ranks of publicists and politicians, breeds whose exemplars characteristically luxuriate in the production of bullshit, of lies, and of whatever other modes of fraudulence and fakery they are able to devise. Old news. He doesn't care about that. What he cares about, however, is these shameless antagonists of common sense, members of a certain emblematic subgroup that call themselves postmodernists, rebelliously and self-righteously deny that truth has any genuinely objective reality at all. They therefore go on to deny that truth is worthy of any obligatory defense or respect. Indeed, they emphatically dismiss a presumption that is not only utterly fundamental to responsible inquiry or analysis, as we'll see with Frege, and thought, but that would seem to be on the face of it entirely innocuous, like it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
So how would postmodernists compare to like skeptics, like are skeptics?
Like what? Skeptics?
Yeah, like just like all the way. Like I forget.
Extreme skeptics? Global skeptics? So,
I forget the term.
Most people, the way he describes postmodernists is closer to relativists. Somebody who would say truth is relative to, I have a chart, social subjectivism. This is actually, Stephen Hicks was not a colleague, but he was at a college next to mine in Rockford. He's at Rockford University. I should give you this chart with a grain of salt, whatever that means. A lot of people have critiqued his work on explaining postmodernism. So it's a fluid issue. Postmodernism, like pragmatism, these are new theories. We're still debating what Plato meant about his forms 2,300 years ago. These are new philosophies. There's no set consensus on what exactly the beliefs are. We're still kind of hammering them out. Pragmatists today are still trying to grapple with what exactly pragmatism is and how it's utilizable and useful for certain kinds of issues. This is an overview to try to give you a sense of what Frankfurt is responding to. I'm not about to get into all of it now, though, but I'll take your question.
Is it not self-contradictory, the view that being indifferent to truth is not a bad thing, while also demanding that others see the truth in being indifferent to truth is not a bad thing?
Are you referencing... Oops, it's the wrong reading. Where the hell is it? I have too many papers up here. Are you referencing Frankfurt's comments, how it is self-refuting on... Oh, I'm sorry, where is this part? Oh, this is annoying. I can't find it now. It's a brief reading, and I still can't find the little thing. There it is, page 1. Those who profess to deny the validity of the objective reality of the true-false distinction continue to maintain without apparent embarrassment that this denial is a position that they do truly endorse. They can't help it. Frankfurt's actually, it seems, relying on Aristotle's sense of the law of non-contradiction. The statement that they reject the distinction between true and false is, they insist, unqualifiedly true about their beliefs, not a false one. In other words, it's true that we believe this. Well, then you do, in fact, care about the truth. Your statements contrary to that are just simply meaningless. You've refuted yourself. Is that kind of where you were going with the question? That's Frankfurt's take, and that would be Aristotle's take of postmodernism too. Yes, and then yes, and I got to move on.
Is this chart by Hicks? So you said he's been criticized a lot for his take on postmodernism. Is what he says about premodernism and modernism pretty much established, or is that also?
No, you're going to find people who disagree with that. Hicks is a scholar of Nietzsche in particular, which is interesting because I don't think he's a fan of Nietzsche. I mean, he disagrees with Nietzsche a lot, but that doesn't mean you can't be somebody who studies them. I mean, there are people who study Hitler. You can You can study the Nazi Germany without being a Nazi. You can study Nietzsche without being Nietzschean. But all of this is subject to dispute. This just gets, I think, at a very quick flash what exactly Frankfurt's responding to. Yes?
How would the postmodernists defend themselves against Frankfurt? And I don't understand the postmodernism column in the row for who, what am I? What, who am I? Human nature. So it's in the far
what
right.
who am I? Social determinist, group conflict. Yeah, I don't like this either. Reductionism doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Social determinism is to say, in contrast to our having a kind of nature that we build or that is given to us, in fact, is determined by social groups. That's, if you include existentialism within postmodernism, which is not necessarily the case, this notion of social determinism is itself, to go back to lying to oneself, a kind of bad faith. You're saying, I am who I am. I'm defined by my culture. Can't do anything about it. I'm defined by God. I have no nature. It's just, it gets built over experience, which actually is closer to people like Jean-Paul Sartre than one might think. But let me just quickly get at what Frankfurt is saying, in particular when he discusses the importance of truth. He doesn't do that really until part 3 when he says, look, the value of importance of truth, especially when we look at the mistakes that might happen, when there are mistakes, for instance, in engineering, we get things wrong, the consequences are disastrous. If you're going to say the truth doesn't matter, this is an obvious pictorial representation of how important truth is. In contrast, he says, the postmodernists think of truth more like this. And this is a caricature, obviously. I couldn't find anything better. I was trying to find some bad art, and Mark Bobro, the other professor of philosophy, last year told me of an example, and I didn't want to use it because I was worried that there were art students in the class who did the work of chairs, but like artwork that were reconstructions of chairs. And he said, well, maybe that's an example of an effort that failed. You're just wrong. Your artistic rendering of a chair is mistaken. That is not good. You did poorly. I mean, if you're an art teacher, how do you grade your students? How would Jackson Pollock have done in class?
There's this one cool chair in the humanities building where it was 2 chairs in one, and one was facing this direction, the other one was facing the other direction. I saw most of them. That was the one I liked the most. I didn't like some of them, but that one I liked.
So here we find then you get into different questions. I forgot. I didn't even read that whole thing. Of what matters, what constitutes the truth, and maybe it's the case that there are different standards based upon different situations. To put it in almost trivial fashion, could you hit the air conditioning again? Just hit the button and then. The power button, and then the air conditioning. It gets too hot. What is the temperature at?
74.
That's way too hot. It should be like 67. You laugh. It should. Anyway, As Aristotle puts it, there are different standards, different criteria for truth, for it was what we would call justification, in physics, as there is in mathematics, as there is in politics, as there is in ethics. These are all perhaps different criteria. And even Frankfurt points out there are criteria of truth in art as well. And in fact, we can see that in an art class, right? And in the background of this is, look, we've got, to borrow from Aristotle, basic laws of thinking. Basic laws of thought that you can't even think were they not assumed to be true. True. You can't have a proposition, a statement. Here, notice we're talking about language. This jumps into our discussion with Frege, which I'm only going to focus on one narrow aspect of. These basic laws of thought, the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction, you cannot even think, much less speak, without presuming these in the background. A and not A, two propositions, not A, denying A, they can't both be true at the same time, they are contradictory. To deny that is to engage, or is to become a vegetable, basically, as Aristotle famously put it. We may have talked about this before in this class, the importance of non-contradiction. To contradict is literally to speak against yourself, in this case. Did we talk about that yet? Maybe it wasn't this class. Real quick, even Avicenna, the medieval scholar, Arab scholar, once said, for those who deny the law of non-contradiction, for those who doubt that there is a truth in the matter with respect to contradictory statements, throw them into the fire. Because to them, being thrown into the fire is the same as not being thrown into the fire. Avicenna wasn't saying, hey, let's really burn people so they don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, although people have been burned for less. He was saying, obviously, they adhere to it. Obviously, they do. And that, in a sense, is what Frankfurt is saying in response to postmodernism that seems to not concern itself with the truth. The question is, and we'll come back to this, does Frankfurt get what the postmoderns are doing? Does Frankfurt get what continental philosophers are really engaged in when they question our analytic, scientific, contemporary conception of truth? We'll come back to that with people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. But before we do that, we have to say a little bit about this dude, Friedrich Ludwig Gottlob Frege, who is ultimately the originator, the grandfather, I guess, of analytic philosophy. He's a logician, he's a mathematician. In fact, most of his studies involved trying to undergird mathematics with logic. And we'll see Bertrand Russell will follow up on this. The relationship between Russell and Frege is actually quite similar to the relationship between James and Peirce. Peirce was relatively unknown, but extraordinarily influential on James. Ludwig Frege was relatively unknown until Russell, because Russell responds. In fact, at one point, Russell pointed out in one of Frege's texts that he'd been working on for years, trying to, a logicist project in undergirding mathematics with logic, Russell pointed out there's a contradiction here. There's a paradox. And it became Russell's paradox. And Frege realized this and said, holy shit, I'm not going to publish this now. It was at the moment of publishing it. And Russell had read it and immediately contacted him and said, you've got a problem here. And it was the Barbara-Russell paradox. Frege, like a rational individual, did not then publish it with the mistake and all. He actually said, I need to fix this, and spent years and years and years trying to fix it, and never could. And yet was still friendly with Russell. Wasn't angry about it. So we might call this the linguistic turn. It's oftentimes referred to that in philosophy. You have a history of philosophy dealing in metaphysics, dealing in epistemology, dealing in logic. And it's strange that it takes until the 1880s for philosophers, for people to stop and think, I wonder if truth about the world is something that really is found only in our representational systems, in our language. We have people like St. Augustine back in the 4th century BCE who talk about language and talk about this kind of picture notion of that words picture the things in the world. That's a very literally medieval view. One that Ludwig Wittgenstein at first agreed to in his early work, we'll see. but then changes in his philosophical investigations. We'll look at both that in the Tractatus. But it's not really until Frege that we get the emphasis that we now do on the philosophy of language. Much of the 20th century philosophy and analytic philosophy is concentrated on philosophy of language. Because, as Michael Beanie puts it, it's really, if you think about it, impossible to think certain thoughts without having the relevant concepts. And it's debatable, but extremely difficult to have certain thoughts or concepts without language either encapsulating them, what shall we say, defining them.
Mediating?
What is it?
Mediating?
Mediating, yes, that's fine. We're mediating them, I guess you could say. Language is a kind of mediation between us and the world. Now, some might say, no, language is the problem. I don't know why this is all background of white behind it. Meaning in the world is language the problem. And we'll come back to this, because on some philosophical views, it's our theorizing and it's our linguistic attempts at explaining things that actually separate us, as this poet assumes, Wallace Stevens. You must become an ignorant man again and see the sun again with an ignorant eye. This is actually a kind of phenomenology where you get to the experience of things pre-linguistically, pre-theoretically. Language, in fact, is a barrier. It separates us from reality. To which the analytic philosophers, like this dude, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is enormously influenced by Gottlob Frege, will say, no, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And in fact, don't you realize that philosophy is just a byproduct of the misunderstanding of language? What? This is him talking to a student, by the way. It's a quote from a student. Why can't you see that? He was an irascible figure as a teacher. I'm not going to get to this, although it's an interesting question, one that Frege is interested in his quantification. How many things are pictured here? Obviously, the philosophical answer to almost every question is it depends. How many things are in the universe? Well, if I'm a monist, there's one. If I'm a dualist, there's two. If I'm a pluralist, there's lots. Skeptic, who doesn't know. Nihilist says, who cares? This dude cares. And boy, did he have a good beard. He'd fit in today, wouldn't he? The revolution of the beard. The renaissance of the beard, I should say, not revolution. I'm not going to talk about that, although his concept strict, or Begriffsschrift in German, where he's trying to get at a formal, ideal language. And this is where you get formal logic. This is where you try to get an understanding of reality, get to truth in a way that avoids ambiguity, in a way that avoids vagueness, in a kind of mathematical precision. This is Ralph. Ralph's concept created by you while reading this. When you stop, Ralph ceases to exist. You stop reading this, your attention is the thin barrier. Anyway, that's funny. Let's skip that. Let's skip that as well. Skip that as well. You have these slides. It's all interesting stuff. Again, with mathematics. But this is what I want to get to. How do words mean? In other words, for analytic philosophers, and I want to focus on this, how can analysis correctly and informatively answer our questions? Analysis, that's the root of analytic philosophy. What are we doing when we engage in analysis? There's a couple of ways of defining this. One is we're engaged in a kind of decomposition. We have a problem, let's try to break it up into its component parts and then analyze those individually. It could be reductivist as well, which is a common form. Let's reduce it to its most smallest units that are no longer analyzable. By analogy, you can look at analytic chemistry. I think they if you take chemistry, you try to reduce things to their most basic components and then be able to describe it in that wholly reductivist approach. You'll see that with neurobiology as an attempt to define and explain what consciousness is. This is a very common form of analysis because it works in science. It works. Let's try to use it with the more abstract, plastic of the sciences, in particular, looking at the science of argumentation, looking at epistemology. But what is that problem again? What exactly is the problem? It depends. This is going to be a weird one, but it depends on what the definition of is. This is a quote, an actual quote from that dude. He really said that. In a deposition, there's a video of him saying it. He's asked about his sexual relations. Is it the case that you had sexual relations with Monica Whiskey, blah, 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 blah? And his response was, it depends on what the definition or the meaning of is. What kind of bullshit is that, you might say? To which I have Frege saying, ja, Bill, das ist sehr klug. Any German speakers out there? Das ist sehr klug?
That's the something.
That is very clever, Bill. It's very clever. Why is it clever? Let's look at this very quickly. Depends what the definition of is. Here's one understanding of is. The isness of is. Is in logic called a copula, right? It has a number of different operations or functions. Frege likes to use the term function with his mathematical background. A is A. What does is do there? That the bachelor is the bachelor. And I don't mean the show, although that's part of the confusion, as we can see in a bit. The bachelor is the bachelor. That is the is of identity. And it is a mere tautology. The term tautology we saw with Peirce. He used it at one point. Just to remind us, tautology is a claim that is trivially true. In formal logic, it plays a particular role. It's useful. Outside of that, anything that is an either-or statement, and you don't confirm or deny, it is either raining or it is not. I am either taller than you at this moment or I'm not. I'm either alive or I am not. Provided it's not a false choice, a false dilemma. I guess I could be a zombie. Because zombies are the living dead. So I don't know where the hell to put that, actually. Either it is raining or it is not raining. That's trivially true. It's true. Good. It's an identity claim. But it is uninformative. You might say, well, so what? Well, let's see. Second, A is B. Different than A is A. The bachelor is tall. In this case, is tall. That's a predication that's qualifying the subject here. The is a predication. A is. Period. That's an existential claim, not in the existentialist sense, Sartre, Kierkegaard, and so forth. It is a claim that the bachelor exists. The bachelor is. This is the one that we're interested in. A is B, which means in this context, plugging in content, a bachelor is an unmarried male. An unmarried male of marrying age. We should probably clarify that. Because my son, who's 8, is an unmarried male. So that has to be clear. I should add that to that. He's not available, ladies. So I should say that up front. The is of definition or of analysis. Now, do we see where there may be an issue? A is A, the bachelor is the bachelor. And look at 1 and look at 4. A is B, the bachelor is an unmarried male. Both of those are true, correct. 1 is informative, and the other is not. This leads to what's known as the paradox of analysis. It goes all the way back. Our original manifestation of it is from Plato and his Meno, the dialogue, the Meno, sometimes called the Meno paradox or the paradox of inquiry. I'm not going to talk about that now. I just want to focus on this. Let's assume A is B. A stands for whatever claim you wish. A is what we are analyzing in analytic philosophy, and B is what's doing the analysis. I have like 1 more minute, so let me just try and wrap this part up, and then we'll have to start again with Frege, which is fine because Frege and Russell are like bosom buddies. I don't know what that means. And if A and B have the same meaning, then our analysis offers a trivial, that is, uninformative, mere identity relation. But if A and B do not have the same meaning, then our analysis seems incorrect. So, and here's the rub, whatever that means, no analysis can be both informative and correct at the same time. If that's true, then analytic philosophy fails. Can't work. is undermined from the outset. We can't even do it. What are you doing when you engage in analysis? You're either giving us trivial claims or you're giving us false claims. You can't give us informative and true claims at the same time. We are out of time, so stick around for next time where we solve the paradox of analysis. And then we look at Bertrand Russell as well. We may not be able to cover all of Russell's readings there. Russell's on belief from the analysis of mind. We've got the word analysis in it. And knowledge, error, and probable opinion. So come back for that. You do have a reflection on that. And I hope you're looking at the study guide to start thinking about answers. And I hope you're thinking about a paper to write about toward the end of the semester. Start thinking about what you're interested in. I will see you all next week. Thank you, Abdullah. Appreciate it. Sounds better when everyone does it, but